I knew we could absolutely trust that even the most microscopic little moment between Helen and the bird would come across vividly. And I also knew that Claire Foy would be willing to lean into the ugly and the feral. She really embraced that. There was no holding back.
Well, Emma, it's such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for taking the time to
My
chat with me
pleasure.
today. I'd love to actually just start off by talking about this writing collaboration process between you and director Philippa Lowthorpe, because you two did such a wonderful job of bringing this beautiful story to the screen. So, what was that journey of bringing Helen Macdonald's memoir from page to screen?
Sure. Well, like a lot of co-writing in film rather than TV, it was sort of sequential in that I did the first few drafts, and then Philippa, as the director, took it over and added more and changed things. But she was always so good to work with. Like, she came and stayed in London, Ontario to work with me, which not all directors would. And she has also the gentlest manner on set. She's just so, she doesn't come across as bossy. She just is very appreciative of what everybody does. And so she gets everything she needs through a very sort of cooperative and gentle style. And that particularly helped working with the Hawks, I think, because she had to use, she had to really protect them. So any days that the Hawks were being filmed, they used a special small unit just for them. We were all told not to wear yellow, and because yellow was the color the Hawks had been trained to hunt. So this film really had to break new ground in terms of working with wild animals, because Hawks do not perform. These really are truly wild animals. You can't tame them, and that's a theme in the book, but it was also a factor in the filmmaking. But I'm sorry, you asked about the screen
No,
adaptation.
no, no.
I suppose the moment Plan B reached out to me 10 years ago now, back in 2016, I had heard about the book but not read it. So I was at an airport, I immediately bought it. And about 20 pages in, I was like, number one, this is going to be almost impossibly difficult, because this is not an easy sort of story-based book. This is a book full of nature writing and philosophical writing and thoughts on other people's books. It's not simply a narrative. But I also thought, I have to do this. This is so interesting and so beautifully written. And it's such a privilege to be allowed to climb inside somebody else's book and somebody else's head, really, and sort of, figure out how the magic happens, going behind the screen, as it were. So I just felt, even if, there was a danger that the fans wouldn't approve of all my decisions, I thought, I want to be the one to bring this exceptional book to the screen. And I knew that its fans were not only numerous, but particularly passionate, because this book felt to them as if it made sense of bereavement in a way that almost nothing else did.
Well, I think you both did such a wonderful job of bringing this to
Thank
screen. Like I
you.
said, it's such a beautiful story, and that pours through the screen so well. But that's really interesting what you're saying about the Hawks, because as I was watching the film, I thought I could never be in Claire's shoes doing this, let alone all of the cast and crew that are actually still on set behind the camera.
I know, I know. Well, very few of them would have been there on the days that the Hawks were being filmed. Like, I deliberately, I visited the set, but on days when it was all human actors, partly because they're easier to talk to, somebody like Lindsay Duncan or Claire Foy, immediately warm and funny and down to earth. I felt the Hawks would take a bit more getting to
Probably.
know.
I think you're right
um,
on that.
Yeah, and I also find it fascinating, like big scenes, like the big funeral scene, watching the first AD, it's sort of at work with all the different extras, and like, guy with red hair, step forward a little faster. It's a really subtle art. But no, seriously, the cast made all the difference to this film. I mean, in its long process of development, at the point where I heard we had secured Claire Foy, I think mostly because Dee Dee Gardner had worked with her, and so had Philippa Lowthorpe on the Crown. So I knew we could absolutely trust that even the most microscopic little moment between Helen and the bird would come across vividly. And I also knew that Claire Foy would be willing to lean into the ugly and the feral. She really embraced that. There was no holding back. She lets herself look absolutely, absolutely mad. And I love that, because it's all the more moving if you see somebody really plunge to the bottom of their personal grief tunnel. She says there was no holding back or keeping things nice.
Yeah. You mentioned the memorial scene there. I was going to ask because I saw the picture you posted on your Instagram from that day on set. I was wondering if there was a scene, you were really moved by writing, but then you were even more moved by it, seeing Claire and the rest of the cast bring it to life.
Yeah, one scene I love in the movie, I would say, is I was really trying to find a way to bring into the film certain of Helen Macdonald's ideas about what's the good of having these interactions with nature. Why would you want to go out killing with another creature? And in the book, the character and now Helen themselves, they're so eloquent about the value of nature sort of read in tooth and claw, as it were, rather than packaged or pretty or Instagrammed. So yeah, I wrote in one scene where Helen is giving a talk and gets, challenged and has to sort of defend herself and has to explain what it is about raising Hawk that feels so real and necessary to her. And so that was a very important scene to me in the writing, and I found it particularly moving on screen because, she sounds so sort of, desperate, and she seems so odd, and she's desperately trying to explain herself, and yet the contents of your own head are often not that clear to the outside world. So I think what I love about that scene is that it takes some of the arguments or discussions in the book and it really makes them dramatic, because she's there put on the spot trying to explain herself to a crowd of hostile people. So it's always lovely if you can find some way to really, show ideas emerging in the moment rather than a sort of pre-packaged speech.
Absolutely. She did such a wonderful job of bringing that one to life. It is definitely one of the scenes that stand out to me from the film. Now, I'm curious for you because, of course, you've adapted some of your own novels, Room and The Wonder, for the screen. And having been on both sides of that as author of a novel and of screenwriter, was there anything you learned from those experiences that you knew you had to do justice to Helen's memoir, that you knew as a novelist had to bring out from her book onto the screen as a screenwriter?
Yeah, I'm very aware of it. And I've deliberately never put myself in the situation of simply selling my work and having somebody else adapt it, because I think I would find that a real shock. So to me, it was very important to consult Helen, not just because they're the writer of the book, but because this is about their actual life. So I remember having to reach out early on and say, Helen, any chance I can change? There's something I need to change about your brother. There's something I need to change about your friend. I hardly dare ask, but Helen has been so gung-ho about this project from the start. And in fact, many of the books you see on the wall of Helen's office are Helen's real ones, and the waistcoat that Claire Foy wears, the hunting waistcoat, that's the real one. And the whole family were welcoming too. That's the thing. I didn't even have to worry that the Macdonalds would be, alarmed by this. They saw the whole thing as a tribute to Alistair, the wonderful photographer who was Helen's father. So they lent his cameras for Brendan Gleeson to use, for instance. So to really feel you have the thorough blessing, and also Helen being such a good writer, understands that you need to change some things sometimes to communicate the story all the more powerfully. That we weren't changing in some spirit of like, we've run a test screening and what's going to be popular. It's more like, in order to make this the strongest story, we need to change a few things. So yeah, we got complete support from Helen and their family.
That's incredible. I wanted to actually ask you, were those Alistair's real photographs that we see towards the end of
Yes,
the film? Are those
every
all?
one of them. Yeah, yeah. I remember looking up every photo of his I could find and saying, we've got to have a slideshow at the funeral, because we've built him up as a character, as a father, but of course we all have public selves as well as private selves. And because Helen in the story is so into her work, again, we needed to show that she gets this from Alistair. So it's a lovely moment when, after all the chat about him being a dedicated photographer, you finally see his work, including that super famous one of Princess Diana and Prince Charles kissing on the balcony after their wedding. He's the one who got that photo. And he, you can see in his projects, like he went to photograph every bridge over the River Thames, for instance. There's that, like special interest topic obsessiveness that he's passed on to Helen, and it comes across so beautifully in the film that, there's so much he taught her, not in some preachy way, but just by being a living example of somebody dedicated to their craft. He died out there on a stormy night taking photographs in London.
Yeah. I actually had to watch the memorial scene twice because once I wanted to focus on Claire's speech, and one I was just focusing in on all the photographs you could see on the projector in the
Yeah,
background.
yeah. Excellent.
Now, one scene I also like to talk about specifically is when Christina delivers the all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, because it's so powerful and bittersweet, beautiful moment that we see between Helen and Christina, which of course references Julian and Norwich. And I believe Helen had that in her novel as well, I believe, too, that line.
I can't remember where it came from. I'm afraid it's been so long since I first started working on this. But I think it was Philippa as a director who decided to really make that key because um, Helen as a character is oddly like a medieval anchorite, all that sort of shutting herself away from the world and obsessively dedicating herself to one thing. There's not a sort of easy or normal kind of hobby, not a hobby at all. Hobby is a word that Helen in the film really resists. So I think the parallel is a lovely one. The idea that by shutting yourself away from the world like medieval anchorites, that in that darkness and confinement and limitation, that you would find this extraordinary sense of consolation and release. So I think that was a really smart decision of Philippa's to bring that moment forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. I loved seeing the relationship in Helen's life, whether it be with her mother, her brother, or with Christina. I think you did such a beautiful job of fleshing out those relationships and seeing how they were trying to be there for Helen, and Helen was trying to be the best that she could be there for them too.
And just as a screenwriter, I found it hugely helpful that even though Helen in the book, gets depressed and shuts herself away from people, she does have these key friendships. So Christina, as the sort of outside world, normal person who, brings the coffee and pastries, and then Stuart as her hawking mentor. Because Helen's talking so much to them and what she says to them is so intense and so much what's on the top of her mind, that really helped me because if this character really wasn't talking about what she was going through, I would find it much harder to communicate her thoughts. But they happened very naturally in scenes of dialogue with her friends, and then with the family, of much more of that tension of the family, disapproving of her life choices. So there was a lovely variety of human relationships already there in the memoir. Yeah, so it made it much easier to manage without voiceover. And voiceover has a place in film, and I like it when voiceover doesn't sort of neatly match the content. So how we use voiceover in Room was almost as chapter markers, and we never had Jack narrating something while you're looking at it. But in this film, I thought if we can somehow communicate what's in Helen's mind without chunks of voiceover, all the better, because that really leans into what's cinematic rather than being like, here's an adaptation of a book.
Absolutely. I think too that stands out in scenes like what one of them that comes to mind is when Helen first kind of lets that anxiety go about Mabel hunting. And we have that first scene where Mabel truly goes off on her own and catches the rabbit. And without any dialogue, it's so powerful and it propels the story forward so effectively while also kind of feeling Helen's emotions through that scene too.
I think this really only works because we got Claire Foy. That's the thing. There are scenes which for a lesser actor, it might seem like they're just running through a field, but she registers every little shift between, excitement and worry and relief and more worry, And to me, the whole thing felt like a bit of a parenting drama, like especially with the new baby hawk in a box, the idea of cocooning yourself away from the world and desperately worrying about whether they'll put on enough weight, that kind of thing. I would say that's a moment parents recognize. So even though overall the story is one of Helen losing their dad, in the relationship with Mabel, it's sort of like Helen has to be the parent. So this beautiful, I love the way it's not, the two storylines are not just an obvious match for each other.
Absolutely. Well, I might have to wrap up here, but it was so wonderful talking to you. Thank you so, so
Me
much
too,
for sharing
Nicole.
your time with me, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy it's out.